In this section, we'll be using Cinema's volume modelling tools. You can think of these as a weird mix between metaballs and booleans. So they're great at adding and subtracting parts of a model, so they're pretty good for mechanical modelling. But they also allow you to do interesting organic models due to the way they can merge meshes together. You'll also find that despite being a modelling tool, they're also pretty nice for doing animations. So join us now and we'll jump on into Cinema's volume modelling tools. Along with nodes and fields, volumes is one of the big headline features for R20. Now, the best way to think about volumes is as a whole new way of modelling things in Cinema 4D. We are traditionally putting things together with various polygon objects or spline-based tools. Well, now we have a new way to approach things. We have volumes. You'll find volumes in the second green icon, these two icons at the bottom here, but you will also find the same thing and a few extras up in the new volume menu we have at the top. But we don't need to worry about this too much because most of the things we really need really are just these two green items here, the builder and the mesher. Now, with volumes, just to get some things out of the way, OpenVDB is a system for loading in volumetric data. If I grab just a couple of files here, these are a couple of VDBs I've downloaded off of the OpenVDB website. We'll include these for you. So here, for example, is some smoke. Let's just drag this in. Cinema will load it in. And you tend to get things like this. Just big, voluminous clouds of smoke and cloud and steam, and these things often get used for fluids. Just to get one thing straight right from the start here, in version 20, volumes are not really for doing these sorts of objects. Although this is something they do traditionally do, R20 has no built-in way to render these little particles as smoke or fire or anything along those lines. What we have in R20 is the model building side of volumetrics. So whilst we can use this data if we want to, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later, just bear in mind this is not really what it's geared towards. The best way for you to think of volumes in Cinema 4D R20 is as sort of a crossbreed between metaballs and bools. I guess you could almost say metabools. No, never mind. It's a way for you to model things. So if we grab a volume builder, this is the sort of fundamental building block which allows you to convert Cinema's objects into volumes. So if I take a volume builder, and we now need to define what this volume should be, what shape it should take up. So I could, for example, take something like a torus. If I drop this torus inside the volume builder, Cinema will turn this, it will throw away all the polygons, they're now trashed, and it will simply use this volumetric area. So you can sort of think of this as a volume of something. What it is up to you. This could be a ring of water, a ring of steel or gold or wood, whatever you like, it doesn't matter. But at the moment, there's no real solid surface to this. What you would need to do with this thing is turn it back into a solid mesh. And that's pretty much what the other green object here is for, the volume mesher. The volume mesher will take each of these little specks. And by the way, all these little squares you see around here, in the same way that a two-dimensional image has pixels making up the image, in 3D volumes we have voxels. So a voxel is a volumetric pixel, and that's what all these little sort of square pieces are here. They are 3D voxels. And by defining this volume, by defining this area, we can drop our builder into the mesher. And lo and behold, it'll turn it straight back into a solid polygon torus for us. So we've basically sort of gone full circle with this. We've gained absolutely no advantage by doing this. However, if I just turn off this mesher for a moment, you can drop as many items as you like into the volume builder. So if I were to also grab, for example, maybe a cylinder and perhaps a sphere over here. If I drop these two items inside our volume builder as well, 1, 2, 3, all three of these items will become part of one single volumetric object. And because they're all part of one single volumetric object, when I turn the polygon mesher back on, they will all nicely merge into one thing. So one of the single most useful, most powerful things that this whole volumetric system will let you do is merge objects together into one single continuous mesh. There will be no overlapping. If I go inside here, there will be no internal structure. So you could use this for creating all sorts of cool, empty, cavernous structures to fly around in, or you can of course use this for merging shapes together. So in this aspect, this is the metaball side of things. If you've never used them, metaballs allow you to sort of merge together shapes into sort of blobs of goo. But the problem with them was always that they were never very controllable. If you try to get any sort of precise shape like this, you'd almost always end up with your cylinder looking like a giant blob. The torus here would turn into a series of blobs. It wasn't very graceful. But what about the ball side of things? Balls are very useful objects. They allow you to cut things out and slice pieces away. Well, that's exactly what our volume builder lets us do. So again, let's just turn off this volume mesher for a moment. And I'll just turn off the wireframe display. On our volume builder, we effectively have a second list of all the items we've placed inside. But these have various different modes. So with a standard bool object, you would normally grab one object and another, make sure that they overlap, and you can then place both of them inside the bool so that one is cut from the other, giving you a lovely bit of Swiss cheese. But this is as far as it ever really goes. There's no nice ability to round off these sharp edges. It's very tricky and cumbersome if I want to start cutting away multiple pieces. You know, let's say this sphere here. Maybe I also want to cut away this one over to the side. Whilst this would sort of work initially for the first cut, when you place another item inside, it will very often go wrong. You'll end up with bits of the mesh missing, the place where they overlap will suddenly reappear, and if I move this over here, it'll sort of work, but the quality is low, the sharp edges, and it will very often just go wrong and give you corrupt surfaces. So the ball's useful, but quite limited in how flexible it is. Well, VDBs are effectively infinitely flexible. So with these two shapes on my volume builder, I am currently unioning them together. They are merging to become one. Well, I could tell my sphere, could you actually subtract? And it'll take a piece away. I could do the same thing with the cylinder here. Say to the cylinder, hey you, could you subtract? You'll notice there's no setting on the torus, by the way. This is the base object which everything is based on. So you can't take away the original object. That has to remain there as the first piece. But my cylinder is now a movable, adjustable cylinder which gets subtracted from the surface. Likewise for the sphere. I have this spherical area to the side which is removing parts of this volume. But of course the cool thing is this can all be meshed. So I can take away and overlap all these items, and there's basically, in my experience of using this, there is zero chance it's going to go wrong. Now, you'll probably notice the quality on here has quite a few issues. We've got all these horrible jagged edges, there's all these spikes along there, you can see these polygons. Well, when you're working with these volumetric systems, you can choose the resolution. So, on the volume builder itself, it has this voxel size. How large is each piece of this volumetric surface? And right now, everything is 10 centimeters. So we've got these sort of quite large, chunky polygons. We can only get so much detail in here. If you'd like to see more detail, go to the voxel size and reduce it. Do be careful if you reduce this thing down too far, you will of course start to get very, very small polygons. So as this thing shrinks, the resolution improves and improves and improves, but you don't want to go too far, otherwise you're going to add a heck of a lot of polygons onto your surface. Now as this goes down, you'll see the quality improve. So the jagged edge, the jaggedness is becoming finer and finer. If I knock this down to maybe 3, or down to 2, or even down to 1, or hey, you can go even lower than this still. The quality of those cuts is going to get sharper and sharper and crisper. There will still always be a little bit of jaggedness, but we'll deal with that when we look at our smoothing system. But you will also potentially see maybe one of the downsides, or at least a behavior you need to be aware of. When you're using a polygon mesh to define and generate a volume, you do have to consider how many polygons the original objects have. If I turn all this volume stuff off for a second, and I show you the wireframe mesh, this mesh will show up in the final produced shape. So you would need to add, let's just turn these off, you would need to add more polygons and smooth off these original objects in order to get a nice decent quality finish. So on my torus, we currently have 36 polygons going around. That is not that many. We could happily bump this up to maybe a couple hundred. But likewise going around, we still have quite low res going around the object. So if I bump this up to perhaps 50, that would give me a much higher quality. And you're going to want to do the same thing for these other objects. Otherwise, when we turn the meshing back on, give it a moment to calculate, the torus will largely look okay. But again, we might want to add a few more polygons. But you can see here my sphere is pretty bad. My cylinder over to the side, that also suffers quite badly. So just do consider the polygon mesh resolution of your source objects which are driving all of this. So what can we use to drive volumes? And importantly, what can we use them for? Well, in terms of what drives the volume, the answer is virtually anything you can think of. I'm just going to turn down the resolution of this mesh just to speed it all up a little bit so we get a bit more performance out of the system. Okay, so we can see that we can use polygon meshes to drive the volumes, but do feel free to throw other things in as well. For example, if I take a spline object over here, and I just quickly draw a little shape there, you can throw spline objects inside your volume. And this spline will just get a sort of set, predetermined thickness running across it. But because it's all one volume, because it's all one system, you can just throw this on top of everything else, and it will happily, smoothly blend and merge in and out of this mesh. Now, in terms of how thick it is, in terms of how much mass the spline will add, well, if you click on your volume builder, each of these items has various settings you can change underneath. We'll probably look at these in a little while, but just quickly for now, with a spline, it's simply going to ask you, okay, what's the radius? How wide should this thing become? Do you just want this thin, spindly little thing running down through the middle, which here is so thin it hardly even exists? Or would you like a lot more meat on the bones? Maybe bump it up to 50 so we get this nice big chunky sausage running through. Okay, so splines, hair. If you have Cinema's hair system, let's see, simulate hair objects. Cinema won't directly allow you to use the hair system, but the hair system can in turn generate splines. So if I had this sphere over here and I grew some hair onto the surface, poof, then we can tell the hair system, don't generate hairs. Let's see where we go, generate. So don't actually create any hair. Just use the hair system to create some splines. So each of these is now a vector. Now I've got far too many here, so I will just immediately turn down how many hairs I've got. Let's just keep it simple for now. Let's say maybe 30 hairs. And if you chuck that inside your volume builder, each of those hairs will become a solid piece. So you can now use all of your hair sculpting and styling tools. You can use all of your hair material abilities to control these volumetrics. So if I stick on a bit of frizziness or a bit of curling, then depending what tools you've used and depending what settings you've got, you can get all of those bits to actually sort of update and show in your editor. We'll show you this sort of properly a bit later as a tip. Anyway, so you can use a hair system. You can also use particles. I'll just delete a few of these. So you can also use a particle system. If we throw in Cinema's standard particles and we spew a few of these particles out, each of these, if it's in the volume system, will create a bit of mesh. And again, because it's one system, they will all happily merge and blend and flow into this one surface. Or of course consider removing them. Hey, I could go to my volume builder and subtract all of these bubbles. So we get these little hollow areas moving through our mesh. So whether you consider this to be a modeling tool or an animation tool, it's both. It's either. It's whatever you want to use it for. Okay, now another area where we can use it is with MoGraph. So if you're using something like, for example, a MoGraph matrix, and we quickly throw on some randomness for our MoGraph system, we can make each of these MoGraph matrix objects become part of our system. So you can use MoGraph objects as the source of all these meshes as well. And you can, of course, use VDB files. So if I just grab my list of files once again, and I throw in this smoke. Do I already have it open? Yes, I do. Let's just reload it. You can take this smoke object, and if you have a volume mesher, so keep in mind, this already has a volume. So we don't need to build another volume on top of this. All we've got to do is mesh the result. If we throw this sort of smoky object inside the volume mesher, okay, we've got this down here. There are various settings as to how dense it is, sort of what threshold it should use for the surface. So again, we will properly look at these a little bit later, but just to make the smoke look a bit better, if I lower the threshold down, I'll get more and more of this smoke system. So you can choose what density this volume needs in order to become a solid object. So we now have this sort of 3D solid version of the smoke object. Okay, and there is one more thing you can do to drive Cinema's volume system. You may wish to go and watch the the field segment of the videos, but you can use a field to drive a volume. So I'm not sure what order you're watching these videos in, so it would help if you've seen the field section before we get to this part, but just in case you haven't and you're doing it the other way around, Cinema has a new field system where you can sort of define these areas in space where effects should work. One of these effects is the random field. It would just generate this area of randomness, which you can use to drive and control many other things. Again, do make sure you go watch the fields video, very useful. But you can also use these to drive volumes. So if I grab a volume builder and I pop the randomness inside, it will give me this random field, this random volume of little voxels, which if we mesh this, will give us this. We'll get sort of a random area. Now, how random it looks depends on what settings you've got on your field. So I will just very quickly set this thing to use some noise. I'll maybe pop on a little bit of animation. And I'll tell my meshing system, my builder, it should have a better quality. So let's lower the resolution down so it's a finer, more detailed surface. Well, using the various settings we've got in here, we can sort of choose how dense this field will be. So we can create these sort of nice 3D volumetric things. So you could use this for creating a super detailed sponge. You could use it for doing sort of medical visualization of perhaps some bone marrow inside a bone. Or hey, if you have some actual hospital CAT scans of sort of medical data, those are often VDB files. You could load those actual scans in and use those. But this gives you the ability to make all sorts of nice abstract shapes, which you could sort of fly through as this cavernous system, or if it's animated and we press play, it will start swirling and undulating and changing over time. So we'll come back and look at this in a bit more detail. Right now I just want to give you an idea about what sort of objects you can use to actually drive Cinema's volume system. So what can we do with our volume system then? Well, this is personally for me one of my absolute favourite features of R20, because it allows new abilities and new things to be made in a whole host of different areas. So, for example, let's say you're doing product visuals. Here's a pretty common one. Let's say you've got your bottle, your can, your container, and it needs some sort of ergonomic shape, some hand grip, or some diagonal lines running through it. You know, the kind of annoying shape where normally you'd have to sit there toiling away for usually hours with Cinema's subdivision surface objects. Well, we can do these sorts of things far, far easier now. Let's say I want some nice ergonomic grips running through this. I could take my bottle and I could grab maybe just a couple of extra cylinders, which are smaller, and I could angle them over here like this. So let's say I want some sort of grip area running through this bottle. Well, so long as I pop that over there intersecting like this, and I give it a couple of friends to join it, so maybe an extra one there and there, we could take a volume builder. Let's just name these so we can keep track. So this is the main body. We could throw all of this stuff inside our volume builder. And so long as your main body is down at the bottom, if it's not, rearrange it. We can just subtract all of these other pieces to cut into it. Now, of course, we can't really see much detail here, so let's lower the voxel size to increase the resolution. There we go. We've now just perfectly cut these nice ergonomic grip areas into the side of the mesh. This is something which, if you had to go through the subdivision surface, you could easily spend a good hour or so trying to get your mesh flowing in the right direction, trying to get the right contours. This just makes life so much easier. But let's see. Let's actually jump into our volume builder and explore some more of the settings, shall we? So first of all, you'll notice there is this setting right at the top, where we have the choice between signed distance field. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to understand what on earth that means. And fog. Now, what these are is actually quite a big topic in itself. We'll cover that as its own chapter a little bit later. But just for now, as a very, very basic version, use the SDF, signed distance field. Use this whenever you're trying to sort of add and subtract when working with solid models. So if you're sculpting bottles with ergonomic shapes, or mechanical items with smooth bevels and radiuses and holes cut into them. So if you're going for just a nice, simple, detailed, solid model, stick with SDF. Fog is designed far more for voluminous things. So it is more geared towards sort of smoke and fire and steam and fluid simulations. Or you can also use this quite nicely if you're using Cinema's field system. But again, we will delve into what the difference is between these two as its own entire topic. So for now, let's just stick with signed distance field. Okay, voxel size, well, we've already mentioned this. This is going to be the resolution of the mesh. Turn it down for more detail, or turn it up for chunkier but faster responses. And you can, of course, always change this just before you render if you want to keep your scene nice and quick whilst you're working. But you may notice there is also a little pull-down menu. This is something we're not going to get into just yet. Again, we'll save this for when we start talking about the differences between these two items. So you can, for now, not worry about these bits. Just stick purely with the main voxel size you see at the top. Now, underneath the list, you may think, okay, fine, there's a list. That's fairly straightforward. That's fairly easy. But actually, there's a little bit more to it. You are probably familiar with the concept in cinema that most green objects are essentially like a folder where you put objects inside. If you ever want to extrude a spline object, you just place that spline inside the green object and it then gets extruded. And this rule generally holds true for almost every single green object. There are a couple of exceptions like this Bezier and the instance object. But now we've got a couple more exceptions, or at least a quasi-exception. Yes, you can place items inside the volume builder, and these things will be added into the whole volume system. But you don't have to. This list you see down here, when it says input type child, this is just Cinema automatically adding these items into the list for you. If I were to remove all these items from that list, so we just revert back to the original shapes, you can use your volume builder in very much the same way you might use MoGraph. I can drag and drop an object into the list and it will join the volume system, even though, let me just simplify that down a bit, even though I haven't actually added it as a child. So if I take all these bits here, and again, I drag them into the list. If you want to drag lots of objects in, you're probably going to need to lock your attributes with this little padlock icon in the corner. So this way I can drag all three and add them into the list. There we go. They'll get added, and I can now subtract all of these items. But they don't disappear. Now this is because Cinema is assuming that these items we're dragging into the list, perhaps we're doing this because we also want to use these objects for something else. Maybe these objects have a dual purpose. They could be defining texture areas, they could be defining volumes, they could be something I'm sticking an object to with the MoGraph system. So it would be up to you to hide these objects if you're going to add them to the list manually yourself. So I would just set all these little traffic lights down to red, and there we go. They're now effectively gone, but they are still part of this volume system. Just keep in mind, don't turn it off with the green checkbox, because that will fully disable the object and we'll no longer be able to actually use it for the volume system. But the thing I really want to mention down here is that you can lose track of which objects are doing what. So you can see here, these objects are now a link type of object, i.e. I've just linked to them. I haven't actually put them inside. But you've got to keep in mind, you can always change these things. So if I remove these and I unhide these objects and I go back to using them as a child, for example, you can rearrange these objects in the list. They don't have to match the order you see up here. So if I wanted this tube here, for example, to be the main object, whichever one that is, tube number 2, if I just place that down at the bottom of the list, that would now become the main item and everything else would get subtracted from that object, leaving us with just this piece here. So yeah, the orders don't have to match. Okay, but that should pretty much do for our list of objects here. So long as you're happy with the idea that these objects can be unioned together to merge things, or subtract them to cut things out, that's usually all you tend to need. There is a third mode called intersect, where Cinema will only keep the piece where they overlap, but much like the standard bool object, this is not the most used mode you're ever going to find useful. Typically, you are merging things together, or you're cutting things out. If you want to go for the intersect mode, let's just get some simpler objects to demonstrate this. Here's a cube, here's a sphere. So let's just place both of these inside. So obviously the default mode is union. This will merge them together into one piece. Subtract will take a piece away. They're the easy ones. But there is also intersect, where it essentially says, hey, keep the piece where they overlap. I guess you could use this if you wanted to have a chunk of object suddenly get broken away and fall away into another piece. That would certainly have a use. But that will do for the list here. By the way, there is just this little divider here. You can actually resize the list if you need a bit more space. Okay, so moving down then. We have 3 buttons: smooth layers, reshape layers, and folders, which doesn't seem to have a word next to it, just a little tiny icon. Anyway, you may have noticed whilst we're working with this system, so let me get a nice fresh one in here for you. So we'll go for a volume builder and a volume mesher. We'll just take a couple of pieces and we'll maybe chop a cube out of there, and we'll tack on, I don't know, let's say this capsule to the side. So if we throw all of these inside the builder, so they become a volume, and then we throw that whole thing inside a mesher, so it becomes a solid object, you may notice that when we, let's unlock our attributes. You may notice that when we increase the resolution, you will start to possibly get some sort of jagged, faceted edges, especially if I say to this cube here, for example, could you subtract from the shape? You're going to get some jagged edges like these. Well, you can just keep increasing the resolution. That is one choice, but of course you're going to get a lot more polygons when you do this. But another choice is to smoothen things. So one of the cool benefits of the volumetric system over the ball is that you can smooth things. Let's just pop that at the top. And this will cause everything to softly merge together. So those horrible jagged edges, they're now pretty much gone. We can melt those down and give ourselves a nice smooth organic form. And of course this will all react to everything I do, so I can still move our cube around here and it will sort of smoothly chop those areas out. So you can make some really nice smooth organic forms there. But the list itself, and rather where the smooth goes, you may have noticed I sneakily dragged it up to the top. Where the smooth is will affect what gets smoothened. So think of this list very much like a list you would have in Photoshop or After Effects. Anything at the top will be sort of the main object, if you like, and any filters, any adjustment layers, that's probably the best analogy here, will always affect everything underneath. So because my smooth is at the bottom, and the smooth will only affect things below it, it's doing absolutely nothing. As I raise it up and drop it above the sphere, I'm now smoothing the sphere. If I drag it above the cube, it will smoothen everything the cube was doing. So this way you can have nice, smooth, rounded corners and relatively sharp, crisp corners all at the same time. So carefully choose where you place this effect and you can decide what it is it should actually get blended with. Now, as for the settings on this, let's just reselect. Okay, you've got the obvious thing, so you've got a strength slider, so you can choose how strongly smoothened this should become. So obviously you can use this to blend. But the main thing to really look at is going to be the filter type. Now, in 2D, in Photoshop, you can blur layers using a Gaussian, Gaussian, however you want to pronounce that one. You can blur things with a Gaussian blur, and that is pretty much what the smooth filter is by default. It's a 3-dimensional Gaussian blur. So everything just becomes really nice and soft. But there are some other kinds, there are some other types. And generally you can think of these as different algorithms. These are just different methods for smoothing things. And just to give you some advice, the best ones, or at least the ones which make the most difference, the ones which have quite significant different results from the others, will be Gaussian, mean, and, new word for you here, Laplacian flow. The median and mean curvature filters, these will be slightly different, but they're so subtle, the differences are so slight, you're probably not really going to care about them too much. So, with Gaussian, that's just a nice big soft blur. Mean will try to hold on to the original shape far more. So yes, it will round off the corners, but nowhere near as much as Gaussian. So use mean if you're trying to keep more detail. Or if you're trying to keep even more detail still, you'll find Laplacian flow is the one which keeps the most detail on your surface. So it will still be smoothing things off and getting rid of the jagged edges, but it tends to start with things which stick out the most, and it sort of stops once it reaches the general shape and formation of everything. So choose whichever one you find gives you the best result. And of course, by all means, do have a play around with median and mean curvature. But generally, I find they're not too different from just the Gaussian, the mean, and the Laplacian flow. Now, underneath, you have iterations. How many times should the filter be run? So whilst you can add multiple filters, multiple smoothing layers, rather than doing that to get a really strong effect, you can just tell it to run a certain number of times. So if I say give me a Gaussian smooth at, say, 20% strength, I could say to it, hey, could you run this 2-3 times? And what you can find is this gives you a nicer balance between smoothness and keeping the original formation. So consider using iterations instead of multiple smooth filters. Down here, we've got some more advanced things. I'm not really going to generally cover those. Might mention one or two in the tips, but we'll leave those for one of the more advanced lessons. So let's go on to our other item here then, the reshape layer. Now, reshape does different things depending on what mode your volumetric system is in. So remember, we've got this SDF mode and this fog mode. And depending which mode we're going for, this reshape layer will actually do slightly different things. But I will say the most useful mode to use it in is absolutely SDF mode. The fog mode, it doesn't do that much which is of particular use. Again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you'll find some amazing use for this, but in all of our experiments, in all of our testing, in all of our playing around with this, we just haven't really found it does that much useful. Anyway, what is it? What does it do? Well, the reshape layer, the simplest way to think of it is it allows you to grow and shrink the surface. So with this reshape, again, we've got a strength slider, but you'll notice we're set to dilate and erode. Effectively, grow and shrink. And this is going to be how much it does it by. So here is my original object I've created. And with the reshape filter, it's currently telling it to grow 5 centimeters. And with the strength, I get to choose how much of that 5 centimeters we're going to get. So if you just want to sort of expand or contract your object, either because it's going to make a better model or because you want to do this as an animation, then by all means go for it. Just set the maximum distance you would like it to expand or shrink. So I could say let's expand 30 centimeters. And we've now got this much stronger, much beefier expansion of the object. Or hey, you can actually go the other way. If I set this down at 0, so this is the original shape we had, there's nothing to stop you from saying, hey, -5, let's shrink this thing down. -15, let's go even further. So you can sort of erode this away and shrink it down so there's less of it there. Maybe you actually want to use this to show some sort of coastal erosion system where you've made this cool 3D rock formation and you want to show it getting eroded and sort of pushed back over time. Or you're trying to show rust growing on a surface. You could use that to say, hey, look at this layer of rust forming up over the surface. Or perhaps you're in construction and you're trying to show some expanding foam for insulation. Here you go. Here's your expanding foam growing over time. So yeah, it'll have some interesting uses. Depends how sort of creative you're feeling. But as for the other mode, close and open, this is a really tricky one to explain. It is more or less the same thing. It will be expanding and contracting. It just does it in a bit of a different way. So with open and close, it tends to attack the areas which stick out the most first, or which are most inset first. So if I start off with this down at 0, just so we've got a starting point, as I increase this, you'll notice the whole thing doesn't grow. Only certain areas, like these corners over here, will start to do anything initially. So it's almost as if you're sort of filling in with some putty. You're sort of filling in the gaps and the cracks first. So those will always expand before anything else does. And once that expansion grows and gets further and further, only then will anything else start to expand. So you can almost think of this reshape filter in close/open mode as a way to fill in gaps. It's almost sort of ambient occlusion, but for a physical 3D shape. So it starts off in the corners and the nooks and the crannies, and it sort of goes from there basically. If you go for the opposite, if you go negative, it will start on the areas which stick out the most and push those down first. So all the other areas won't generally get touched until this has gone so far that there's nothing else left for it to do. So it is an expansion and a contraction, like the other default mode is. It just attacks different areas first. Okay, right, that will do for those two filters. The last icon here is just a folder. If you'd like to group things up so you can keep track of what is doing what, you can place items inside folders and keep track of them this way. So you could have an entire folder for one part of your rock formation, another folder for part of the cliff which is about to fall down. Essentially, it just gives you a way to quickly arrange and sort out things you have in your list here. In terms of any functional differences, it will also affect these filters. So if you're trying to filter an entire folder but not have that filter affect anything else, filter the folder, and now this, none of these smooth or reshape filters will be able to affect anything outside of the folder. So it's also good for containing effects which you don't want to affect too many other things. Okay, but there's your three little buttons down at the bottom. Right, let's do the difficult topic, shall we? In your volume builder, the very first setting you've got is SDF, signed distance field, or fog. Now I'm going to try and explain what the difference is between these. Please keep in mind this will be quite a technical explanation, and I will say if you don't manage to follow all of this, or you just haven't got the time, you can live a long happy life never really particularly changing this. But by fully explaining what these things are, we can give you better performance, we can give you better quality results, and we can help explain some odd, strange behaviours which you might not understand why they're happening. Essentially, this will also help you to sort of troubleshoot any issues you've got. Okay, so SDF, signed distance field. When you create your volume, this SDF is hollow. Although it's a volume, and you might sort of assume, oh, it's filled, it's an entire volume of these things, these little voxels. No, it's not. If I zoom in here, boop, it'll look a bit weird, but these things are hollow. We can go inside this sphere of volumetric panels. The SDF is only ever a skin of voxels. So it won't fill the entire object up. So this first of all allows you to get better performance because it doesn't have to calculate thousands and thousands of little voxels inside. But it does also allow for all of this sort of adding and subtracting, these sort of Boolean type operations. So let's break it down. Signed distance field. I'm just going to throw a scene file in here. So this is using some MoGraph to try and help demonstrate what's going on. If you were to do a cross-section of this sphere, or some sort of wibbly-wobbly sort of shape, you would see something like this. Over here, let's say this is outside, and down here below, let's say this is inside the object. You will have used a polygon mesh to define where you would like the surface to be. So this is the surface of our geometry which we've thrown inside the volumetric builder. What the SDF does is it covers it in this coat of voxels. Some will be slightly outside the surface, and some will be slightly inside the surface. How thick this coat is, if I go back to my volume builder here, is all these settings under here. So this is the size of the voxel, but if you unfold it, it's going to ask you how many voxels should be inside and how many should be outside. So the default is 2 and 2, which means in our cross section, you're going to see sort of more or less 1 or 2 voxels outside the object, and then kind of 1 or 2 voxels inside the object. Now this is important because if you try to adjust the surface too much by expanding it or contracting it or smoothing it or applying various different effects, you may run out of voxels. So let's say I applied some sort of effect which would chop off this piece over here. You may find all of a sudden your chopping has gone through the voxels, reached a bit of blank space where there's no surface, and then it's back into the voxels again. So if you're ever doing some really strong effects, particularly with fields and fall-offs and smooth filters, that sort of thing, if you notice you start to get some strange effects on your interior and exterior range, just try increasing them. The higher these things go, the slower the system will get, but it will be more resilient to strange unwanted behaviors. When we get to our tips at the end, I'll see if I can show you some examples then. But just for now, let's just say that this interior and exterior range, the higher they go, the slower the performance is, but the more resistant to horrible, weird artifacting the surface will be. Just as a really quick example, let me just throw another scene in here. Let it load. Okay. I've got a couple of cylinders in a couple of volume builders, and both of these have a smooth filter applied. But you'll notice this one over here, let's just get rid of the other one for a second. This cylinder inside the volume builder, so strictly speaking, we've got all these nice little voxels creating the surface. This gives me a pretty decent result. But when I go to smoothen this thing out, let's say I've done some other things to it and I decide, hey, I'd like to apply a smooth layer to this. When I do this, the quality gets worse. Now, it will be kind of subtle here. There will be a bit of video compression getting in the way. But between the original shape and the smooth version, the smooth one gives me all these weird artifacts. This is the kind of issue you can run into with this issue. The smooth layer, it's blending and Gaussian softening all these voxels, and the distance it does it is 2. So in other words, imagine you're working in Photoshop and you apply a Gaussian blur filter and you type in blur it by 2 pixels. That's pretty much what we're doing here. We've got our smooth, it's Gaussian, it's blurring it by 2 voxels. But remember, the default setting is that this thing is only more or less 2 voxels thick. So what we're actually doing is we're almost sort of clipping, we're hitting the outside edge of where these 3D pixels are, these voxels. And as a result, you get all these sort of horrible lines like these. A quick way to improve the quality: boost the size of the voxels, or sorry, boost how far the voxels go. So these currently go 2 in and 2 out. If I boost these both up to 3, immediately the quality will be improved. We'll now have a much smoother result with all those horrible lines pretty much gone. So just as a little tip there, increase the voxel range when using smooth filters just by 1 or 2, that's enough to do it, and you will get a slightly better result. Just do bear in mind, you will probably halve your performance by doing this, because we now have more or less twice as many voxels in the entire system. Okay, anyway, back to our description. So with this SDF, signed distance field, that is literally what it is. First of all, let's go with the end. Let's throw one in. Where have we gone? Here we are. Right, field. Field is simply referring to the fact that this is a field of voxels. It's just this giant area with voxel, 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 voxel. That's what the field is. It just means a very large area of stuff. Distance, so we're working backwards here, distance is referring to the fact that this field of voxels will be a certain distance from the surface. So this is where we told our system it should actually go, and it will now create voxels within a certain distance of that object. And as for the signed, well, this is just a mathematical programming thing. Because these voxels can be outside or inside, mathematically these would have positive values or negative values. So when it says signed, it literally means there can be a minus sign in front of the numerical value. Signed literally just means a number can be positive or negative. So that's what it is. That's our signed distance field. A field of voxels within a certain range, a certain distance of a surface, and they can be positive if they're outside or negative on the inside. Right, so that's what it is. Now, what about fog? How does fog differ? Fog is a simpler way to describe a volumetric surface. When we take our builder and we throw in a sphere, so this is our SDF version. If we switch this over to fog, first of all, the display will be different, and it's going to be different because it's got a lot more information to show. Not only do we have this collection of little voxels around the outside, this thing, and it's going to be quite hard to show on the video capture here because I imagine all these little dots will sort of disappear away, but this is filled with all these little voxels. All these little dots are actually inside and filling up this sphere. So there's no weird tricks with inside and outside layers. So what's the advantage or what's the disadvantage of doing this? Well, first of all, one disadvantage. This object can never expand beyond the current size. It's perfectly fine shrinking down. I can trim off bits on the outside, but whatever size you set to have your volumetric system as, if you're going to use fog, that's it. You can't really expand out any further because this has already defined the absolute maximum size it can be. You can also find that you get less performance from it. Because there's so much more data, because there's so many more values being stored, you will inherently in some cases just get worse performance. But weirdly, in some cases, you will get significantly better performance. Let's take an example here. What you can find is that the generation of the SDF takes more time to work out than just filling everything in. My general advice is, if you're going to be doing anything where it's just this sort of volumetric swirly, ethereal thing, so fires and smokes and maybe things like using a random field, these will generally give better performance with fog. So let's just go ahead and show you an example of this, shall we? So if I take our builder and just throw it straight on into a mesher, and I drive all of this using a random field. For the random field, we're going to make the field a noise. So on the field tab of the random field, we'll say, hey, you should be noise. And just so we can get this thing moving and seeing what it does, we'll throw on a bit of animation. So, I don't know, 25% speed. We'll keep it fairly slow. And what I'm also going to do is increase the quality of this. So this is quite low res. Let's go and bump this down to 2 centimeters. Maybe that's a little bit too detailed. Maybe let's pull that back to 4 just for now. Okay, so this is the SDF. And the issue you're going to get with this is because the random field is so detailed, because it's sort of phasing in and out, leaving all these hollow empty pockets, this is going to be filled internally with all this structure, especially if I tone back this noise. If I just pull back how strong this is, so it's a little bit more sparse. Cinema has had to make this sort of nice skin all the way through the object, filling in all these areas, and that's quite complex to do. So if I were to press play and see my performance, I'm going to get maybe just 1 or 2 frames per second. I'm going to get some really rubbish performance with this. In fact, if you want to see it a bit more accurately, bring up the FPS command. Hold Shift and press C. This will give you your command window where you can search for commands. And we're just going to bring up a command which isn't in any of the menus. If you type in FPS, this will give me my calculate frames per second command. It just lets me know what performance the software is giving me. So if I say animation test, it will play through the animation, check and measure how fast it's able to go, and at the end it will give you a frame rate that it was able to achieve. Now we haven't got to sit here waiting for the whole thing to finish. I think it's already scanned enough frames. If I just hit escape, this was giving me 2.5 frames per second. That's pretty terrible performance. If, though, I switch my volume from an SDF down to a FOG, it will look a little bit different just because of the nature of the system and how it works. But I will just say this has more polygons than the SDF did. So this is actually a more difficult task for it to generate. Yet if I run the same test, remember we were getting 2.5 frames per second before. If I test the FOG, much better performance. In fact, so much, I'm going to leave it to just finish the test. 14 frames per second. So our performance is roughly sort of 6 or 7 times faster than it was before. So in general, with areas where you're filling in the entire volume, fire, smoke, noise-based volumetrics, stuff like this, you will find FOG gives you a far better performance. And okay, so there is also another difference behind all of this. Let's just get a new scene here. Get rid of the FPS command. Right. You've got to keep in mind, these things are working in different ways and they give you different abilities. And this next bit is possibly the most tricky thing to really explain. So, with our SDF, you have the ability to essentially bool things. You can add, you can subtract, you can keep the bit where they overlap. That's a nice, useful bit of power. But with FOG mode, we have a different set of controls. With FOG mode, you're going to see a lot more commands which look much more like Photoshop. Yes, you can add and subtract, but you've also got multiply and divide and normal mode. A FOG is a 3-dimensional grayscale image. In the same way that you could add and subtract values for a bump map, or if you had a grayscale image in Photoshop, you could add and subtract and merge. That's effectively what we have here. And if you look really carefully, sorry, it's very, very small here, but some of these little white dots are white. And if you look on the edge of my sphere here, some of them are grey and some of them are black. This is because these values have varying different densities. So the white ones are the highest density object, whereas the black and grey ones around the edge, these have a lower density. And if you want, you can merge and control these volumes by shifting how dense the surface is, or rather, you can sort of add and subtract and multiply these grayscale values with one another to make the surface. So, let's just throw this thing inside the mesher. So you will see we do get pretty much the same kind of thing. If I move the sphere over here, they'll merge together, but you'll notice that the merge isn't very nice. It's not very graceful. In fact, it looks downright rubbish. This is because Cinema is keeping any part of the surface where the density is high enough. Again, remember those little grayscale values? Cinema is keeping anything where the grayscale value is above 50% grey and it's removing anything where it's below 50% grey. So when I pop this on top, this layer, this sphere layer on top of my cube, is literally just a layer slapped on top. If I put a layer on top of something in Photoshop, it would cover it up. And so too, all these grey values, they are covering up these white ones. They're not just being added onto it, they're not just being merged. These grey values will be overwriting the cube's white ones because this layer is on top. So probably the most useful mix mode in here is max. Max mode tells the volume, keep the areas which have the highest maximum volume, highest maximum value. So this cube has lots of white values. These are 100% dense. This sphere has some weak ones around the edge. Normally these will overwrite. But if I set the mode to max, it will keep whichever one has the highest value. You can almost think of max mode as union from what we saw in the SDF, so merging them together. Likewise, you have different modes, so let's turn our meshing back on again. So with normal mode, it isn't likely you're going to want this for much because it just tends to make things look worse. Max will keep the ones with the highest value. Minimum will keep only things with the lowest value. So effectively, this is like the intersection area. And then all the other modes you've got, you can add things together, you can multiply them, you can subtract and divide, and you can sort of get them cutting out. But as you can see, fog is generally far less suitable for doing sort of nice adding and subtracting and cutting operations, because the way the maths work, the way you're adding and subtracting these values, it's not the most straightforward thing, and ultimately it often just doesn't give you the best results. So stick with fog for anything where it's a volume of things, and stick with SDF for when you want to do adding and subtracting and merging, which, to be brutally honest, is probably what you're going to do most in R20. The only time I generally go with the fog myself personally is if I'm loading in some sort of ready-made file I've downloaded from the internet. So you can download VDB files. Those are very often fogs, so you will just be stuck in fog mode with those, I'm afraid. Or if I happen to be using some sort of field to drive the volumetrics. Fields work best in fog mode. Everything else works best in SDF mode. And that is the simplest way I think I can possibly put that. It's not an easy topic. It is quite tricky. But if you've had a little bit of trouble understanding any of that, let's just be honest. Stick with SDF mode and you'll probably be fine. How's about that? Okay, so the final chapter then for the introduction into volumes is going to be miscellaneous. Little bits and pieces, a few tips and tricks, and just a few little bits which didn't fit into anywhere else. Okay, let's just mention VDB files. When you download a VDB file from the internet, again, there's plenty of free ones out there, all sorts of bits and pieces. You can do this in one of three ways, or at least you can sort of end up with one of three things. Some VDB files you will find are more or less just a single object. When you go to load it, you get this window popping up saying, hey, what part of the file do you want to load? How large should it be? And that's kind of really all that really matters. But you'll see here, I have one volume grid. In other words, I have sort of one volumetric piece of data, just simply called density. When I load this in, I'll get this light blue icon. And there's nothing you can really do down here other than select a different file and reload it. There's not really any controls. This density is just one single object. And the way you tend to control these, so these will be fog meshes. Almost all of your VDB files you download will tend to be fogs because they are tended to be used for sort of fire and smoke quite a bit. But to use this, let's grab our volume mesher. So we don't need a builder, remember, this is already a volume. You can just pop that straight into the mesher and you'll get an object. But you might notice, hold on, where's it all gone? When I turn this thing on, why don't I have this? Why do I only have this area? Well, remember on our previous example, when we were going over the differences between SDF and fog, I mentioned that when you mesh it, let's just turn this off, you get all these little dots. Some will be white, you can just about see a few down over here, and in this case most of them are almost black. This data set is the density of some smoke. So these white bits, these have the highest density of particles, and these black ones have a very low density. So clearly there is something burning down here, and then as it gets further away it spreads out and disperses. So given that these fogs are just a grayscale set of values from black to white, from least dense to most dense, the volume mesher has a slider. It will ask you, okay, how dense does a particle, I guess the kind of particles, but okay, how dense does a voxel need to be before it should become solid? So if I say, oh, well, I have very high expectations, these things have to be very, very, very dense before you should bother meshing them, you're going to get less. If you come down, however, you're going to say, okay, right, if it's 50% density, mesh it. Or if we go down further, if it's 40%, so this now includes the 40% voxels, and you can keep going down and down and down and down until eventually you get the density you're after. And yes, this can be animated. If you're trying to show the density of some sort of cloud coming in, you could keyframe this. But if we keep going all the way down here, we can just say, look, hey, just mesh everything. It doesn't matter how weak it is, just turn it into some sort of solid structure. And there we go. I've got some sort of hideous erupting bit of popcorn there. But I want to mention the existence of another way of doing this. So these little dots, these will store a value. And the thing is, I don't know what the values are. These white ones, these could be storing a value of 10 or 100 or 1,000,000. I don't know. I honestly don't know what these values are. And there's so much data, you can't really see it. So what it does by default, it just takes the smallest value and assigns it black, and the highest value and it assigns it white. And this slider lets you blend between whether the black ones should be solid, the grey ones, or just the white ones. But you can specify it with an exact value. So right now we're just doing it sort of based on that grayscale you can see in the editor. If you unfold the voxel range, there is the option to use an absolute value. So I could say to this system, could you mesh anything with a value higher than 0.001? Or I could say, could you only mesh things with a value of at least 0.5? So if you're trying to see what the values of those little dots are, you're trying to see what the actual numerical value is, use this absolute value option and you can see, hey, this is only meshing things which are at least 0.5 in value. And you may also find that this gives you a bit more control. You may have noticed when I was using the slider, most of this over here doesn't really do much. And then all of a sudden, in the last couple of pixels, boom, the whole thing suddenly appears. So my useful range is really only maybe sort of 5 or 10%. With the absolute values, you may find you can much more smoothly blend through this volumetric system. So as a little bit of a hint, when using fog or when using loaded in VDB files, switch the volume mesher to absolute mode and use this number underneath. You may find it works a little bit nicer. And just whilst we're in here, I know I have deviated from my topic of loading files in, but you do have another option called adaptive mode. I just thought I'd quickly mention this. If you have a mesh loaded and it makes this really dense mesh, you can adaptively reduce how many polygons it has. It's very, very much like Cinema's, where have you gone? Cinema's polygon reduction mode, in that you can just adaptively remove polygons which aren't needed, so you can simplify the mesh down. It'll start off with the most detailed areas, So if it's fairly flat, it will remove those first, and it will try and preserve any little details that happen to be on the surface. But you've got this really quick polygon reduction slider. It might save you a bit, but that's up to you. Anyway, back to loading our files in. So when I've loaded this smoke.vdb, we've been given a single mesh, and that's it. That's all we get. If I start a new scene and I load in this fire VDB, so this is just a different set of data. If I load this one in, you'll see, we have two items in our volume grid list. One which is showing smoke density data, and another one which was some temperature data. If we load this in, if your object contains more than one set of data, you'll get a slightly different object. This will list all the different multiple things which can be inside. So I've got one set of data here called temperature, which if I toggle it off, this is just some temperature data, and another one here called density. Now, in other files, this may equate to burning flames at the bottom and then smoke at the top, or these different items could be just various different parts of the object. But what you'll get is this group, and it contains each of these items. If you decide you don't want one of these for any particular reason, or you decide, hey, I don't need that data, I just need this bit here, you can actually rip these items out of this attributes list and pop them into your objects list. Or rather, you can hit the detach button underneath. So if I select the density here and I say detach, I will be left with this density item as its own separate individual set of data. You can see the fire object here now only has one item inside. If you do ever want to merge them back together, or you do ever want to take a different file and merge it into one set of data, you can just drop this back inside, it'll remove it from your object list, and it's now sort of merged them all into one. So what I could do in theory is I could grab my smoke file, which was just something else completely different on another file. I could copy this, pop back over to my fire file, which is just some different smoke, and I could pop this in and say, hey, could you add this fire? Oops, let's call it something else. Inferno, more dramatic. We could say, hey, could you add this into the VDB group? And we now do have one single group of VDB data. We could take this and skin the entire thing as if it's one object. But all of these sub items, you can just break them apart and attach them whenever you need. Okay, and by the way, this does also give you the ability to save these out. So if you do have multiple VDB sets of data, you can convert them into a group and save it out as a new file. So if you need to save them out for some other reason, or you want to give someone some simulation data, there you go. And speaking of simulation data, one popular use of VDB would be for some sort of fluid sim. Now, I don't have any with me here. I'm not much of a fluid sim guy. But if you want, you do have this volume loader object. Now, I will just say, you can use this just to load single objects like these. It does still work fine for those. But the main reason is for animations. If you load an animation in, use the volume loader, load the file, and you can then choose how many frames of animation should it use, how fast should it play back. But predominantly, you're going to use this for things like fluid simulations. So if you're a bit of a RealFlow user, save them out as a VDB, and you can load those volumes straight into Cinema now without having to sort of pre-mesh them elsewhere. You can use Cinema's Mesher now. But sticking up in the menu, there was a few more commands. So we've got these two here, smooth filter and reshape filter. Now, I will just save you quite a bit of time. These may look slightly familiar. In our volume builder, we have smooth layers and reshape layers. These are the ones which blend, and this is the one which can expand and contract the surface. Well, we have pretty much the same thing up here, smooth and reshape. But these exist as an object. They have the exact same settings, so you are still going to choose, do you want to blend things? So let's just pop that inside. Do you want to blend things down? Do you want to expand and contract? So there's really not any significant difference between this smooth layer I added from here and this smooth object I added from the menu. The reason it exists as an object, or the reason you have it both down here and as an object, is these items, the layers, these don't exist as real items. They're just purely in this little list. So if I like what this reshape filter is doing and I want to apply it to 10 different volumetric systems, I can't. However, if you went for the reshape filter, which has the exact same settings in it, you could apply this to as many volume builders as you like, just drop it into the list, and you could now control many, many, many different volume systems, all with the same smoothing and reshape filters, and you haven't got to sit there reproducing these filters down here. Otherwise, the reason these exist is just purely for quick convenience. You can just throw a layer in, it only affects this, it's not going to affect anything else. It keeps it sort of nice and neat and self-contained. The last item though which we had up in this list is volume mesh, which at the moment is greyed out. Now this is an interesting thing. The volume mesh basically takes a builder, a mesher and a smooth filter layer, and it converts it into a one-off command. So let's say I have this platonic shape and a donut and, I don't know, just throw another cylinder over there to the side. You can select as many bits as you like and run the volume mesh command. And hey presto, boom, they've all been merged together into one single continuous mesh. So literally all it's doing behind the scenes is it adds a volume builder and it places the items inside. It smoothens it with a filter and then it meshes it into a polygon mesh. It makes it editable and it throws away all the old parts. So it's doing all those steps for you in one go. Now, why? Why would you want to do this? Why would you not just do these things yourself? I mean, surely you're going to get far more control using the mesher and the builder and the filter yourself. You can change all the settings. Sure, yeah, of course, that's true. The volume mesh, it was made for one particular purpose, though I'm sure people will find other reasons. This was predominantly made for sculpting. Often when you're sculpting an object, you will have your base mesh that you're starting from. And let's just say that the thing I want to start sculpting on, I've hacked it around with perhaps the magnet tool, and I've pulled this over there and I've stretched that over there. But for me, this is the shape I would like to start sculpting on as my base mesh. Well, when you're sculpting and when you're sort of ultimately using subdivision surfaces, this is terrible. All these stretched polygons, all these triangles sitting at the top, this is a pretty bad mesh to start polygon sculpting on. This is the perfect candidate. If I take this and I quickly run the volume mesh command, it will take this horrible distorted surface, redivide it and give me a nice quad evenly distributed mesh. This is a much better candidate for me to now start using my various polygon sculpting tools with. So that's predominantly why it's made. Now, just to quickly mention, it does have a couple of settings. If you hit this little cogwheel next to its command, this will just ask you a couple of questions. What voxel size do you want? So how much detail should be on there? Do you want it to pre-subdivide? Now, you may find that you have the same issues we had before with our donut, in that if I mesh this to a really nice high quality and hit OK, sure, it's done the volumetric thing and it's given us all these little polygons, but because my original mesh was so low res, you can now see all these horrible faceted bits coming through in the mesh. So pre-subdividing, let's run it again with a little cogwheel. If I pre-subdivide it sort of once or twice, maybe even 3 times, it will smoothen this out first and then run the meshing command, giving you a much nicer, much smoother result. Very useful. And the last little bit we had in there, what was it? Oops, no. Make sure you hit the cogwheel. The last bit really is smooth. So if I happen to have a couple of cubes I want to quickly mesh, normally when I run the mesh command on this, it will give us this. So there's a little bit of smoothing in between, but not much. We can just choose to boost this. So volume mesh, we'll get some more quality, and I'll tell it, could you smooth things 50%? That will give you a much smoother edge compared to not. I mean, how much of a smoothing you get does actually depend a little bit, actually quite a big bit, on your voxel size. So you may need to boost this smoothing sort of as high as you can. But depending on the size of these voxels, it will smoothen between these two surfaces more or less. So it's just a quick command. It runs through those little bits for you, predominantly for sculpting, but hey, I'm sure you'll find some use. Maybe you've downloaded some really rubbish model from the internet and the quality of the mesh is atrocious. This would let you regenerate the mesh with nice quads. Okay, so to finish off then finally, just a few more little hints and tips, some general advice from working with this. First of all, when you are working with splines, if we have a builder and a mesher, pop those two together, and we take some sort of spline, let's just quickly sketch a wiggly swiggle there and throw it inside our volume builder. We get this big long sausage. Lovely. Just a quick note on sort of size and quality of this. If I improve the quality of my mesh here all the way down to, let's say, 2, you'll notice, this is not quite as smooth of a sausage as I thought it was. This is actually quite lumpy, like a worm. So first of all, congratulations, you've discovered the secret worm capabilities of Cinema RD version 20. But let's assume you don't want this. On your volume builder, select your spline and have a quick look at the settings. So there's one obvious thing here of radius. How thick and chunky should it be? We can, of course, turn this up and down. And if it's chunky enough, all those little bumps you see are just going to kind of merge into one, and it probably won't really matter too much. Although, maybe not entirely. And then you've got density. How many of these little bits are there? Strictly speaking, this spline is just a series of little dots, and we're just merging them all together. So density is how many there's going to be. So if you're getting problems with your spline objects looking too bumpy, you can increase the density, and it will just add more and more little blips along there, and just turn it up until you're happy with it, basically. Obviously don't go too far. The higher you do this, the slower the software is going to get, but just bump that up and you can get rid of all those silly little worm body part nodules running across the surface. Okay, on this topic though, when I throw a sphere into my volume builder, you will see, no, the quality is terrible. We can see these polygons. Well, we already know that we can add more polygons to improve the quality, but you do tend to often need to push that quite far. So there is actually another choice. There is actually another option with this. On your volume builder, and this basically only goes for the sphere. Maybe it'll get expanded to other objects in future, so possibly keep an eye out for it. But for the sphere, there is an option called Perfect Primitive. This tells the sphere, be perfect. And there you go, that's it. It makes a perfect sphere. It's the only shape it works with, unfortunately, but it's better than nothing. I guess if you're going to use spheres, you may as well have this setting turned on for them, because they'll just look nicer. Let's see, what else can I do tip-wise? Right, refreshing. Okay. As your meshes get more and more complicated, the software will naturally get slower and slower and slower. So one thing you're going to want to avoid is having to regenerate this mesh. As I move this sphere around, watch this text at the bottom of the screen go mad. Every time I move the sphere, it refreshes and regenerates the mesh. Now, I'm not expecting you to read it, but if I just really crank up these quality settings, if I throw in a smooth filter and I go for an even higher quality mesh, you'll see down there, let's just really torture it. Ooh, it's warning us this might take a while. Good, that's what I want. Okay, down here in the corner, calculating volume builder, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So this is going to take a while whilst it generates. Maybe I want to go through my volume builder and change 5, 10, 20 settings, but I don't want it to sit there recalculating the volume mesh after every single adjustment I make. This would make working with the software very slow. You can tell the volume builder, don't automatically update. This will allow me to make my various adjustments, move things around, resize them, tweak my smooth filter so it does something else. Basically, you can sit there and go through all the changes you need, and when you're happy with your adjustments, you can manually press update. And it will now sit there calculating the new mesh, which should look a little bit different. So that's going to be very, very useful if you're dealing with some incredibly heavy, dense VDB data. Maybe save it for when things get a little bit too slow, but it's definitely useful to have that down there. Okay, cool. But just sticking on the refresh, at the moment, at this point in time, certain objects in Cinema will cause the whole VDB system to needlessly refresh. Probably one of the worst offenders at the moment is going to be MoGraph. So if I take a builder and a mesher, and I take a cloner, which is going to be duplicating, say, some little stick figures, and I just want these little stick figures to all become part of this volumetric system. Okay. You can place your cloner inside the volume builder, and these things will get merged together. Let me just increase the quality. I think this might be a little bit too low. Bum, 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 bum. You can refresh. Okay. What you may find is Cinema keeps refreshing. When you apply materials, when you animate it, when you move some lights, when you select or deselect it, or even just switching from one view to another can also trigger it. Basically, be careful with MoGraph objects. And if you need to animate it, okay, fine, leave it as MoGraph, you don't really have much choice. But if you've just used this system to create lots of items, let's say you wanted to put 100 ribs along the side of a squeezy plastic bottle, if they're not going to move, if that's done and finished and set in stone, I would highly suggest for now, make your cloner editable. This way, it's not going to endlessly refresh when it doesn't need to. Maybe this will improve in future, hopefully it does, but for now just keep in mind MoGraph objects inside volume builders will keep regenerating quite often. So you're sometimes going to be better off just making your cloner objects flatten down. And still on this same topic, just one final thing. Be careful of groups. When you place objects inside volume builders, so this is going to be a performance issue predominantly. When you place objects inside your volume builder, 1, 2, 3, Cinema can generate each one of these pieces individually. It will generate A, then B, then C. But if I were to group these up, let's say I have a few spheres and I want to cut these out of my torus. Let's just turn it off for a moment. So let's say I've got this and this and this, and I want to cut these spheres out of my object here. It might seem intuitive, and it's not necessarily a bad idea. It might seem intuitive to group these things up, put them all inside a null. And then in the volume builder, we can say to it, hey, could you subtract the group. And it will work. There is no technical issue with this. It will physically work. But here's the thing. When I update one of these spheres, if I try and move this around, Cinema is going to be rebooling. No, never had to use that word before. It's going to be rebooling all of these cuts because as far as the volume builder is concerned, my null is one single object. You will get better performance by not grouping these things up, just putting them straight directly into the volume builder and setting them all to subtract individually. It is going to be a little bit more work, and yes, your stuff down here will start to get a bit busier and more full. But now when I move one of these spheres, I'll get better performance because it doesn't have to update the others. None of those other items changed. So just one thing to keep in mind, the more you group things up, the slower the performance will get. Consider flattening off your hierarchies. Okay. Next, I'm going to give you a hint for using Cinema's reshape ability. So I'm just going to grab a file I've already made here. I'm just going to drag this in. Again, we'll include this for you if you want to have take a look around yourself. Right. It concerns Cinema's reshape filter. Now, I've used a reshape filter here to slightly expand this object by 5 centimeters. It's literally just the default settings. But one thing you can tend to find is when you do this, you may start to get some lower quality finish on your surface. So, do you see these sort of weird concentric circles I've got going around here? This is one artifact you can get on your surface. It depends on the mesh, and it is sort of predominantly caused by the way this stuff gets meshed by the VDB, OpenVDB system. So it does literally make concentric circles on these sorts of formations. It's basically just a way to avoid this. Not entirely certain why this works, but I will just say it works, so it's worth knowing. I have on this object, so these are identical, but you can see on the left-hand side, I don't have the issue. The difference is, this object, I have a reshape filter set with the default settings. It is dilating it 5 centimeters. On this one, I have the reshape filter set to dilate 10 centimeters, but I've set it to 50% strength. Now this is just a bit of a weird quirk. If the strength is above 50%, let's just turn that up there, give it a moment while it regenerates, you'll get the bad quality. And if it's below 50%, you'll also get some bad quality. It's not as bad, you can just about make out the concentric rings down there. But if you leave the strength for this bang on 50%, and you then use the offset to choose how far it should or shouldn't go, you will, in my experience, you will get better quality results in every single possible situation. I have not found any model where this tip doesn't work. So yeah, in a nutshell, when using reshape filters, set the strength to 50% and just use the offset. This will give you slightly worse performance because it is having to do more work and then take half of it away, but this is not a great result. This is going to give you a much nicer finish. So there's one of my little hints for you. And for the hints and tips video, that's us done. So we're going to give you some examples now of actual real world projects, some actual things you can go ahead and make. Let's go enjoy those, shall we? So we're going to do a couple of simple examples to get our feet wet with the system. The first one is going to be a bathroom countertop sink. I think it's a pretty good example of how you can use quite basic shapes with all the various sort of Boolean-esque tools to make what would otherwise be a fairly annoying thing to create with the other modelling tools. So we're going to take a sphere. This will be the main body of the sink itself. But the sink is going to be a sort of wide-ish oval shape. So in order to properly stretch and squash this out, we will have to make the object editable, but not just yet. As you've already seen a couple of times, whatever polygon tessellation we have on our object here, this is pretty much what we're going to see in our final production as well. So we are going to add a lot more polygons to this, just basically to be on the safe side. We're not going to use a lot of objects, so we don't have to worry too much about how many polygons the source has, but it will help us. So on our sphere, where it says segments, let's just really boost this up. Let's see, 100, that's a lot better, but it's still going to get a little bit faceted. So maybe let's go sort of 200 or 300, just really go up there with the numbers. And it can also help to change the way the sphere gets tessellated. So you'll notice here we have the least polygons around the edge, and then at the north and south pole it gets really dense. So we're really kind of wasting most of our polygons in an area which is probably about to get chopped off. So when it comes to the type of the sphere, rather than this sort of atlas projection with the north and south pole, let's switch this over to a hexahedron sphere. And this is essentially going to give us a much more even distribution of points and polygons around the surface. So our 300 segments are going to be, well, much better used, let's put it that way. Okay, so now we've got more polygons on here, let's turn this into our oval shape. So we're going to make this editable, and we're going to grab our scale tool, and all I'm going to do is sort of gently make it a bit wider, and maybe a little bit more shallow. So we're going to end up with a sort of a fairly wide, slightly flattened off sphere, but the underside of this will become our sink basin. Okay, so let's jump straight in and throw this into a volume builder. Let's drop our sphere in there. And by the way, it's a good idea to name these parts as we go along. So this is going to be the main sink body, essentially. But let's pop that inside our volume builder, and that gives us this nice cloud of voxels. And we know we're definitely going to have to turn the quality up. We don't want to go too high straight away, just because we don't want to slow the software down too much. So let's knock the voxel size down from 10, and we'll just knock this down to, let's say, sort of 2 or 3, just a smallish value, but not so small it's going to be too slow to work with. Okay, so our sink then. So this is the basin shape, but we want to chop off the top of the surface. We want a flat finish to the top of this sink. So for this, we can grab a cube. We may need to make it slightly larger, just so it fully envelops the sink itself. But we're gonna raise it up. We're gonna raise this thing up so it just chops off and effectively sort of slices in half our sink object. So this is the top removal segment. And we'll drop this inside the volume builder as well. And initially, this will get added onto our voxel system. So what we really want to do with this is remove it. So on the volume builder, tell the top removal cube that this should be subtracting from the whole thing. And hopefully this is immediately going to start looking a lot more like a bathroom sink. So our next issue then is generally that this thing is not hollow. There's nowhere for the water to go. So to hollow this out, we do pretty much want just the exact same shape again, but slightly smaller. So let's not beat around the bush too much. Let's take our main sink, and on my keyboard I'm just going to choose copy and paste, so we have an extra copy. And this one is going to be the hollow object. This will be hollowing out our sink. So we can choose how thick the sink is by basically shrinking down this object. So I'm just using my scale tool, and just do notice when I am scaling this thing down, I'm not clicking on any of these coloured arrows, because this way it will uniformly shrink down. So just find a bit of blank space and shrink it down a bit. But however much space I leave here, this will be the thickness of the sink itself. And just do note, it will probably scale more in one direction than it does on the other. Because our object's oval, when you uniformly shrink down, it doesn't give you a uniform thickness on the outside edge. So once I've sort of decided how thick the outside edges of the sink should be, you may need to slightly tweak the other direction, just so that you get a fairly uniform amount of thickness going around your sink surface. So that's about okay. And again, we haven't got to get this perfect straight away. We will be able to come back and change all of these things anytime we like. So let's drop this inside as well, and yep, you've guessed it, we can set this object to also subtract and remove itself. So we now have this empty hollow sink basin. Nice. So we're going to need a hole in the middle. We're going to need somewhere for the tap to go at the back of this ceramic unit. So actually our first issue is we don't really have anywhere at the back of the sink for the taps and the handles and the fittings to sit. So when I've subtracted this hollow shape, let's just disable it for a second. When I've subtracted it, it's probably actually subtracted too much. We need to actually put a bit back. So there's a shelf at the back for the fitting, for the soap, for any things you want to use. So yeah, we do need to subtract it, but we don't want to subtract all of this. We actually probably want to remove part of this shape before it cuts into the main body. So this is where your folders can come in useful. If I had a folder, and I call this, so we can double click, and I call this hollow back flattening. There we go. And I drop my hollow shape inside. I essentially want to sort of pre-cut the back. So if I take a cube, make sure it's wide enough to cover everything, and I just push it backwards. How much of the back end do we want to remove? In other words, where should we have a nice flat backside to the sink? Well, I'm going to say, again, just visually for now, we can always tweak this. I'm going to say, let's encroach it this far. That way I'll get a flat back to my sink here. So what I want to do is I want to pre-cut this cube into this hollow sphere. So let's chuck it into the volume builder so we can use it. And in the volume builder, we'll pop the cube inside and we'll say, look, could you, in this folder, could you subtract the cube from the hollow shape? Okay, so there we go. We can see our cube has now cut off the back of this hollow shape. And then with this whole collection of things, could you then subtract that from the main body? So we're subtracting the cube from this, and then with the result, we're subtracting everything from our main body. So for the After Effects people, we've essentially sort of pre-comped an object before it gets cut out. For the Photoshop people, well, you've already got folders in your layer list. They work pretty much the same with all these add and subtract modes. So once that's done, I don't really at this point care that this cutting tool is made of a cube and this hollowing sphere. So if you like, you can just fold this down and just ignore the fact that there are other items in there. But do keep in mind, it does mean I could grab the cube at the back and tweak exactly how far in, how much of a shelf I will get to keep at the back of this sink. So maybe I want sort of quite a substantial area. So let's say something like this. This will give me somewhere for the soap, the fitting, and anything else I want to throw on the back of the sink unit. Okay, now we will need some holes. We're going to need a hole down here for obviously the plug hole. We're going to need a hole over here for the fitting to sort of slot into. But that gives us a unique problem. Even if we do cut a hole here, we've still got all of this bulk. This shouldn't all be here. This sink should go across here, and then there should be a nice big hollow empty area where I can fit all the pipes behind it. So yeah, you can probably guess exactly what will happen here. Let's take another cube. Let's make sure it's sort of wide enough. And we'll just push this thing backwards. And notice here, I'm leaving it sort of at the distance where we get to have this thing continuing around. And I'll slide it underneath. So I pretty much want to cut this piece out of the entire unit. So this is the back lower cutting tool. In it goes. Choose the volume builder. And yep, here we go. We just got to tell this new piece that it should subtract. And there we go. We've now cut out that area. So when we do punch the hole in the back, there is somewhere for the hole to actually end up. So let's do those last two holes then, shall we? And yes, nice and easy. Let's grab a cylinder, a bit large. Let's shrink this guy down. And let's lower it down into the sink. Ooh, try and keep it centered. Let's not wobble it around side to side. We're not Ariana Grande. Let's push that down there. slide it back a bit. We're going to try and sort of keep this fairly where the lowest point of the sink is, otherwise the water wouldn't drain properly, but let's say round about here. And much like we did with the spheres, we want to make sure that this cylinder has lots of polygons going around. Otherwise, when we do the high quality sort of final model, you're going to see these faceted faces. So on our cylinder, we're just going to set the rotation segments right up to 100. That should be fine for something fairly small like this. Okay, let's subtract. So this is our sinkhole, which I am entirely aware means something entirely different in America. If you find a sinkhole in your back garden, you're in trouble. Okay, so sinkhole, volume builder, once again, we'll subtract. There we go, we've now got a hole, and we can do the same thing for our tap fitting at the back here. Let's just hold Control and duplicate this sinkhole, but this one will be the tap hole. Oh, sorry, the faucet hole. There we are. That's what you get. Let's move this back, raise it up. By default, keep in mind, all these objects will always be adding and unioning onto the object. Even if you duplicate something which was subtracting, when you duplicate it, the new fresh copy will default back to the union mode. So set this back to subtract. Make sure the hole goes all the way through, which it doesn't at the moment. Let's take our tap faucet hole. Go on. We'll rename this one just to keep everybody happy. Tap slash, oh, how'd you spell it? Faucet. That looks about right. Let's lower this down, make sure it punches all the way through. And there we go. We've now punched through and we've got our broadly finished sink. But we will tweak it a bit. We will sort of get this looking nice. So if we mesh this, if we take our volume mesher and drop all of this stuff inside. Okay, cool, sure, there's our sink. But the quality is a bit low. We've got jagged edges, we've got wibbly wobbly bits down there by the hole. So let's improve the quality. Now, the most obvious thing to do is to just add more polygons. On our builder, with the voxel size, shrink it down. Just make these voxels finer. So if we drop it down to 1, that helps, but we are still going to get rough edges, and I think realistically, is regardless of how far we go with this, it's still always going to have some sort of jagged edge running around on these parts. Plus, this is supposed to be ceramic. These sort of ceramics will tend to have quite rounded corners. You don't get sharp edges on ceramic like this, not generally. They're usually sort of quite rounded, so they're much easier for us to clean and work with when you wouldn't want to try and clean that sharp corner down there, for example. So let's actually push that back a bit. Let's go back to where we were a little. Let's go back to 1 centimetre. We can try the smooth filter. Let's give ourselves a bit more space. Open this up. If we throw in a smooth filter, this will smoothen things out, but do be careful with where it is. Smooth filters will smoothen everything below them. So you typically, unless you're trying to be fancy, you typically leave them at the top of the list. This way everything gets smoothened. So this is better. We've now lost all those horrible jagged edges. But if anything, this is now too smooth. So we want to try and push this back. Now, if you're trying to keep some level of detail in the shape, don't just necessarily turn down the strength of the smoothing. All that will do is leave you with a few jagged edges and a smooth shape. So I'll leave this back up at full, and we'll go for one of our different filter types. So Gaussian, this is the softest, blurriest of all the filters. If we go for mean, this is much better at maintaining the original shape of the object. Okay, so that helps quite a bit. If you wanted it to represent the original shape even more, you could go for Laplacian flow. I love saying that word. But in this case, I think our mean option is actually a pretty good option. We're looking pretty decent here. So that's more or less the shape I'm after. All I've got left now to deal with, again, I'm not sure how well these will show up with the video compression, but we've got these concentric rings around here. Maybe if I throw a light source in, it will sort of exacerbate the issue. So there we go. We're talking about these bits here. These horrible lines, these horrible concentric rings. We'll get them around the plug hole. We'll get a few over on the side here. We dealt with this in one of our tips, but just in case you skipped over it or weren't entirely paying attention, when smoothing off VDB objects, my smooth is smoothing 2 voxels. In other words, all these lumps, all these little square specks, the smoothing will jump from sort of here, 1, 2, over to there. So that's the width of the smoothing. But as a result, it does sometimes leave these horrible concentric rings. And that's usually because, if we open up our voxel size, the thickness of this ceramic is only 2 voxels thick on the outside and 2 voxels thick on the inside. So our softening filter is more or less blurring across the entire width of the entire object. Anyway, long story short, if you've got these horrible concentric rings, open up your voxel size and boost the interior and exterior to 3. This will slow, oh no, not 32. This will slow the software down a bit, but the quality is remarkably better. So this is probably something, if I'm ever using a smooth filter, I will almost certainly always do these little changes here. Anyway, there we go. I think I'm fairly happy with that. So we've got our sink. It's one single continuous mesh. And just for fun, let's quickly throw a material on. We'll do an Uber material, shall we? Let's make use of the new system. If only because I know that to get a decent ceramic, all we've got to do with this is turn on a nice, shiny, reflective coating. And that's it. That is now a nice, glossy, ceramic, shiny, white sink. Okay, cool. All right, so that's our sink project done. The other project we'll do in a moment will be a sort of milky splash. I'll see you for that in a moment. For this project, we're going to do something a little bit different. Whilst the VDB system is great at doing products and bottles and packaging and all those sorts of things, you can also take it in quite a different direction and go a little bit more sort of, what's the best way of putting this? You can do things where it's not a precise mechanical object, something sort of with well-defined sizes. We can use this for doing sort of organic splashes and fluids and liquids. Now, whilst Cinema R20 doesn't have a fluid sim built in, if you're just trying to do something for an image or a poster or a still, you can still get quite nice looking fluid things, and even more so with R20. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab Cinema's old particle system. Let's just rip this menu off so we can find a couple of bits in here. I'm going to try and make a sort of splash in a liquid surface, and we can then sort of use that as a still image for a poster or for some packaging. So what we'll do is we'll grab an emitter, and we can just sort of leave the animation playing whilst we play around with this. So I want a watery surface. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet. We're making this up. It could be milk, it could be honey, it could be some chocolate milk. There seems to be a bit of a milk theme here. But either way, I want a splash. So the splash will have to go up. So with this emitter, I'm just going to turn it around 90 degrees. Hold shift, you can lock it to 10-degree increments. We can get these particles going straight up, cool. But we want an interesting splash shape. So what I'd suggest is maybe we could get some sort of spinning rotation on there and then get it to fall back down again with some gravity. So we can add some rotation, but to begin with, the rotation will go the wrong way. It's like a front-loading washing machine rather than a spinning tornado vortex of liquid. So just like we did with the emitter, we're going to rotate the rotation 90 degrees so it's sitting upright. So this way we should now get some nice spinning particles flying straight up towards us. It's a little bit hard to see exactly what we've got here, so let's just add some more particles. On the emitter, on birth rate, let's just pop this up to 100, so now we can get a better idea about what we're creating. Cool. So these this splash is going up and spinning around, that's nice, but we then want it to sort of arc over and start to fall down again. So let's pop in some gravity. So up they go, and then back down. But we need a splash which sort of splashes outwards, so you can see the thing causing the splash in the center. So let's try on our emitter. Under the emitter page, we can use a smaller emitter size and then spread them outwards. So rather than this 100 by 100 centimeter panel, we'll tell our emitter it should only be perhaps 10 by 10. So a much smaller area, but we'll help this hopefully by spreading them outwards. If we stick a 45-degree angle horizontally and vertically, this should give us more of a spray going outwards, hopefully. Okay, so it's more of a sort of tornado shape now. That's looking better. But one thing you've got to be careful of when using cinema's legacy older material system, particle system, rotation tends to overpower things. So we're going to fade out this rotation so it doesn't keep on spinning things over and over and over again endlessly. So with our rotation, let's use the new full-off. Let's use the new field system. We're not going to do much with it, but it's here, so we may as well. So on the rotation, on the fall-off tab, let's just go for a simple shape. Just a nice simple spherical field. This way, only things within this pink area will spin around and rotate. So if I shrink down this spherical field on the rotation, oops, let's get our scale tool, that will help. We can only spin around the bits in the middle, and then once they're free of the rotation, they're then sort of free to fly around and do their thing a little bit more. So this is looking okay, I think. Okay, cool, that's looking good. Let's just hide the spherical field so we don't have to sit there looking at it all the time. So, we only want a little splash. We want these particles to come up and then just pretty much just stop there, as if we've got an early freeze frame of some slow motion footage. So at about frame 20 or 30, this is roughly where we want them to stop. If we tell the emitter that the lifetime should only be around 30 frames, they'll jump up and then just suddenly stop. So we've got our little sort of splash shape, and then it's stopping, so that's all good. Now at this point, I think the only thing I really want to change here for now is just, I'd like a bit of a wider splash. I don't want this sort of long, tall funnel. So if we speed up how fast the rotation spins, that will cause these things to get flung out even further, hopefully. So we currently have a speed of 20. 20 what? Who knows? Who cares? Doesn't matter. Let's just bump it up to 30. Okay, so that's going wider. Maybe 40 or 50. So that's helping. It's going wider. I'm getting a bit of a weird shape as they go up, though. So maybe let's have a little play around with the spherical field. Maybe move it up a little bit higher or down a little bit lower. That's better. That's more of a sort of splash coming outwards. Perfect. Cool. Right. So now we've got this sort of basic shape. What do we do with this? Well, we can throw away our particle tools, and we can just throw our emitter into a volume builder. And to begin with, we'll have this big clumped mess of squares. This is not really helping us. Let's make this finer. Let's tell our volume builder, not every 10 centimeters. Let's go all the way down, maybe down to 2. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. Let's go all the way down to 1. Right. With anything which isn't solid geometry, so we're talking particles, matrices, spline objects, etc. These are going to need a size because these particles don't have a size. The volume builder needs to assign a size to them. So on the volume builder, select the emitter, and you will see there is a radius setting. This is how large each blob will be. Let's tone these down. Let's start off at 5. What do we get here? Okay, well, they're much smaller. Looks terrible, but they're much smaller at least. Let's go further still. We're trying to make this look like a splash. What happens if we knock them down to just sort of 2? Okay, so we've got all these little specks, but obviously this isn't really looking like a splash. Now, in my mind, we've got a couple of choices here. One setting we have, if you're using a particle system, is velocity scale. So right now, all these particles are just making a little sphere of volume. If we turn up the velocity scale, and I'd recommend you use the arrows because it's quite a sensitive setting this is, the higher this goes, the more stretched out they become. But they will stretch in whatever direction they're moving in. So it helps, you get more of a streak with this, but I'm thinking even if we turn this up, this is really just going to look like a series of sausages getting thrown into the air. So I do have a backup idea. Okay, so let's remove this emitter from our volume builder. Remember, don't delete it, because otherwise it will actually delete the object. Just drag it out of the hierarchy so it doesn't do anything anymore. Let's try tracing it. If we select the emitter and add a MoGraph tracer, this will leave a series of spline objects. These might be a much better candidate for tracing and turning into a volume. So let's try dropping the tracer into the volume builder. Okay, again, don't forget we're going to get the same settings. So we've got to tell our volume builder that the tracer, each blob should not be 15 centimeters wide. It should only be, well, again, I don't know exactly off the top of my head. Let's try 3. Still quite thick. Let's try 2. Okay, so that's better. But you may notice it still doesn't look like a nice series of trails. This is going to be because each of these splines will just get a series of blobs along it. That's just how the spline system works with VDB. So with this turned on, with the tracer selected, turn up the density. Each of those lines, if we turn this up, more density, will now become a trail. So there's no specific number you should really aim for, just turn it up higher than the default, which is, I believe, 0.1, which is not many. So turn it up, 0.2, 3, 4, 5, and these trails will get nicer and smoother. Now this is starting to look a lot more like a splash. In fact, I'm sure you can do a fair few interesting things with this. This is almost a nice dandelion flower. Anyway, we've got all these trails. Let's blend them together. So in your volume builder, hit the smooth layer button. How's that? So this is taking all of those trails, merges them together and smoothens them out for you. That's not a bad little splash. You can always play around with how long the particles last. So if I press play, I'm not expecting a great frame rate from this. But as the particles fly, so you could even animate this if you're trying to make it an animated splash. But I think my particles are maybe dying out a little bit too soon, or maybe possibly I just have too many particles. So if I have fewer particles in here, let's maybe go for 75. Let's rewind, see if this helps. Do we get some more interesting shapes? Yes, we do. It's not quite so dense anymore. But again, do feel free to play around with the lifetime. So if I say, hey, last for 50 frames, then they'll come out, they'll fall down, and this thing should generally extend further out as it goes. So this bit's up to you. You will have various slightly different results from me. Have a little play around until you get this sort of a nice little liquidy splash coming up. But there we go. There's a nice little splash. Now, I will say from here, if you're just intending to use this as a still, it's probably a good idea to make all of this editable. Because this is based on particles and particles are based on animation, then when you next come to reload this project, you're going to have to rewind and press play to frame 58, otherwise it just won't look the same. So what you can do is you can convert the current state of this into a VDB file. So if you're happy with a splash, and let's just say I think this is okay, I may just add a bit more resolution to this. Now this is something you've got to be a little bit careful with. When I increase the resolution of this by lowering my voxel size down, so I'm already down to 1, so let's go the only place we can. Let's go sort of 0.5. It will very likely change the shape a bit. This is because the smoothing will depend somewhat on how large these bits are. When you run a blur filter in Photoshop, if you have a low-res image, you need to use less blur. If you have a really high-res image, you need more blur to compensate. And it's the same in 3D. Gaussian smoothing is just a blur filter. So we could try running the smooth filter twice. If we bump the iterations up, this basically tells Cinema, smooth it, and then smooth it again. Give it a moment. Okay, so that's looking close. Let's maybe run it a third time. This is not going to help with our software speed. So, okay, so that's helping. That's getting us much closer back to our shape. So, if we're generally happy with this as our splash, what you can do is go to your volume builder and press Make Editable. This will convert your volume builder where you can drag and drop various objects and all these filters, and it will convert it into just a standard VDB file. So if you would like to actually export this to any other system which takes in volumetric data, you can come down here and actually save this file out as a VDB file. Otherwise, you are welcome to just leave it in Cinema itself. But this volume builder, we don't need this null object. That's not going to do anything for us. We can drag that out and say goodbye. But at this point, actually, we can say goodbye to everything else because there are no more particles. This is now just pure volumetric data. We can lose the emitter, the spherical field, the rotation, the gravity. These things just simply aren't needed. We've now basically made our own volumetric VDB data. Okay, so we want this splash coming out of something. I should just say at this point, by the way, if you just want to mesh this and turn it into polygons, you can, of course, just throw this all directly into a volume mesher. There you go. But we actually want to do something else with this. We want this splash to obviously come out of a surface. So how do we now take this sort of made editable VDB mesh and merge it in with other things? Well, actually the answer is back exactly what we were doing just a few moments ago. We just grab another volume builder. You can drag volumetric VDB data into a builder and it turns it back into voxels again. So we've got a fresh set of settings, so we're going to have to redo this again. So if I go down to 0.5 for the resolution, there we go. But because this is now back into a builder, and we should probably rename this, otherwise it's going to get confusing. This is our splash VDB. Cool. So we can now merge it in with other things. So let's say I've got a round cup or a jar or a container. Let's say I need a cylinder. This will be the water surface or the liquid surface which this is bursting out of. And let's just get them to overlap slightly. Let's pop that over there and just say, hey, look, you can burst out of that. So here's our cylinder. Give it a few more polygons around the outside edge, as we're already used to at this point. Chuck it inside the volume builder. And this has now become one. These two things are merged. We may wish to give it a bit of a smoothing to sort of blend our splash into the surface. So on our builder, let's throw in another smooth deformer. And depending where we place this, and depending on the order of all these bits and pieces, let's see. No, it's not really helping. Anyway, throw that in there, and you can now blend your splash into your liquid surface. Maybe I'll raise this cylinder up a little bit more. Oops, let's grab it there. Just so it's a bit more sort of enveloped and encompassed. A bit like that. Okay, and then finally throw it back into the volume mesher, and we now have a nice single complete uniform surface with a splash coming out of the top. So as far as the VDB side of things goes, that's sort of everything I want to show you. If you want to stick around for a couple of minutes, I'll just throw some materials on here, maybe a bit of lighting, and I'll just get it looking a little bit nicer. So what is this going to be? What do we want it to become? Well, this one here is sort of quite thick. I've maybe smoothened it a little bit too much. So let's say this is a sort of syrup honey with something dropping into it to cause the splash. So material-wise, let's just stick with our legacy materials, the ones we know best for now. And as far as the material goes, let's see. Well, it's going to be transparent, so let's lose the colour. And on reflectance, always generally, I personally tend to get rid of this specular highlight because it just makes things look sort of powder-coated and matte. So on reflectance, default specular, let's hit remove, and let's just activate some transparency. And so long as we dial in a nice sort of warm honey colour, and we give it some refraction, it doesn't matter too much what you choose from this list, to be absolutely honest. Either just go for something liquidy, like water, and there you go. There's your nice sort of liquid flowing honey material. We can throw that on. But this is going to sit inside a jar. Now, I'm not going to sit here and do the entire jar. We're just going to do a nice close-up of the top of the surface. So let's actually just grab something like a tube object. Because with this, in our top-down view, we can just set the inside of this hollow tube over here, so it just slightly overlaps the honey, and set the outer radius. So this is how thick the glass is. There we go. Give it a few more segments. 36 is really tight. Let's go for 200 so it looks nicer. And then we can just set the height. So how tall should all of this be? So we're just imagining that we're sort of looking at the top of a jar of honey, and this is the glass edge just showing up. As long as we fillet the edge, maybe not quite that much. Turn the radius down a smidge. I don't know, 0.8. There we go. So there's our glass edge, and the glass is going to be pretty much the same as the honey. The only difference is, so I'm just duplicating with control here. The only difference is the glass doesn't go yellow, it stays transparent. There we go. So this is our glass. This is our honey. Let's pop the glass on the edge there. And the main thing left here would be to have something in the middle which looks like it's dropping in, and to add some sort of sky so we actually get some sort of reflection and refraction off of all this stuff. So let's say we've got new honey with chocolate inside. Don't ask me to invent you a new product for your company. I'll only come up with silly ideas like this. So here's some sort of chocolate Malteser type confectionery. It's plummeting down there, causing the splash. Let's just check the size. Okay, so let's raise it up just so it's sort of somewhat sitting inside the splash. Okay, and let's give it a chocolate material. So standard material. The colour is brownish but dark. So just a sort of nice milk chocolate kind of colour should do us here. And the reflection, again, let's get rid of this rubbish specular highlight. And let's throw in a proper reflection. So this, if you're ever unsure about what to do exactly with your reflections, just go for Beckman. Nice easy answer. And the chocolate is not obviously polished chrome. So generally with these sorts of things, when you're just trying to add a bit of reflection, turn on dielectric Fresnel. Dielectric Fresnel will change it from being chrome, because remember we did set a colour in here. So with dielectric Fresnel, it will change it into just being an extra bit of glossiness on your original material. But this is probably too polished, so let's just throw in a little bit of roughness. 5, 10, 15%, just so it's not too perfect. And chuck that on. And the final ingredient then is going to be some sort of environment, otherwise we have nothing to reflect. So let's lob in a sky. Let's name this thing down here to chalk. And with our new material, this will be the sky. And all we've got to do is jump to the colour channel and throw in some sort of HDR image. Now, this is a kitchen item, so let's just be lazy and throw in the old kitchen HDR everybody has. If you don't have this one, we'll include it for you, but do feel free to just Google kitchen HDR. It's one of the most common ones out there. And we'll just pop that onto our background. And let's give this a render. Quick bit of advice, if you're going to be using sort of blurred reflections and all these transparencies, you're probably best off, if you can, going into your render settings, switch your render engine to physical, and just to get really fast results, under the physical settings, set the sampler to progressive. This will give us pretty much an instantaneous result when we hit the render button. Boom, there we go. So we've got our honey, it's splashing up. Maybe let's pick an angle where we can actually see the chocolate going down and splashing inside. Let's try this. So there's our chocolate, plummets in, splashes into the honey, and then it all comes gooping up and out of the surface. There we go. I think that'll do for us. I just wanted to quickly throw some materials on so we get something a little bit nicer looking. Right, that's it from me for the volumetric system. I'll see you for some of the other lessons.